Muslims are concerned about media. Media says things and Islamophobes have a heyday. They thrive on it. But we sit in America and complain about it. But there is one organization in the United Kingdom, Muslim Council of Britain, or MCB, which has decided to do something about that. I wish we can bring them to the United States. But they have issued not one, but one, two, and now there is third report. And good thing about this work is that they are now getting some reaction. Sunday Times is a paper, and its chief editor says, well, their criticism is correct. What is their criticism? To discuss with us is one of the lead of this program at Muslim Council of Britain, Rizwana Hamid. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Walaikum salam, and thank you for having me on.
Well, tell us, what is this report which you have generated?
So how British media's coverage of Muslims and Islam, that's the title of the report. So what we've done is look at the coverage between the period of 2018 and 2020. And we worked with a very strict methodology that we've developed with academics who are experts in the field of corpus linguistics and who've also covered and done reports on how Muslims are covered in the media. So with this methodology, what we do is on a daily basis, we get fed articles and broadcast clips that contain one or more of 50 keywords that we've identified relate to Muslims and Islam. So it could be anything from Muslim to Sharia to hijab to ISIS to, jihad, any of these words. And what we then do is measure these articles online and broadcast clips against 5 key metrics. So we ask, is the article or broadcast clip generalizing, misrepresenting? Is it inaccurate? Is the headline misleading or the imagery misleading? Is there a lack of prominence given to a Muslim voice? And depending on how many yeses or nos we get a rating of it being either inconclusive, not biased, biased, or very biased. And from that, we then do further statistical analysis. So what we have come up with this is that when it comes to online digital articles, almost 60% associate Muslims with negative behavior or aspects, so negative coverage. And in broadcast, that figure is 47%. The right-leaning press is worse than the left-leaning press. When it comes to television, regional and local broadcasters fare much better than national broadcasters. And drama seems to be one of the main kind of drivers of negative tropes and narratives about Muslims and Islam. And the theme that generally Muslims are reported in and the context and paradigm is in relation to extremism and terrorism, with many, many tropes of, Muslims being incompatible with Western values, Islam being a threat to Western democracies. Muslims are trying to take over Europe, so the Islamization of Europe, as they call it. Women have no agency. Islam is misogynistic, anti-Semitic, inherently intolerant of other religions. So all of these tropes that exist, what we've shown and how our work is very different to anybody else who's monitoring or even, assessing how the media reports on Muslims and Islam, is that we are evidence-based. So everything that we say, we show with concrete examples, whether they're misleading headlines, whether it's imagery that's been misused or is completely irrelevant, whether it's kind of broadcast clips that give platforms to far-right individuals who attack Muslims and yet go completely unchallenged. So I think that's why we've been quite successful when it comes to engaging with the media. And we do engage with them very constructively by showing this evidence base. We hold roundtable discussions with them. We have one-to-one meetings. We kind of make submissions and into guidelines and editorial policies. And they can't kind of hide behind the facts, because when you show people the evidence, it's very hard to kind of deny it. They may not always agree with us, but the fact is they have to look at it. And, we've shown quite extreme examples as well, whereby people have been defamed and libeled and have had to go to court. And some of the major establishment broadsheet newspapers have had to pay out hundreds of thousands of libel in damages to people that they've completely reported on inaccurately, to the extent where they've destroyed people's lives. One person that was accused of being a fixer for child groomers, he lost his job at the council where he worked at. His marriage broke down. He couldn't see his children for 2 years. So real life impact. And we've also assessed that when major stories, negative stories come out, it has an impact on hate crimes on the ground. And we see an increase in hate crimes. So when Boris Johnson, for example, made his comment about, Muslim women in niqabs and burqas looking like letterboxes and bank robbers, the statistics went through the roof, almost over 300% in terms of hate crimes. After the Christchurch attacks, again, even though Muslims were the victims there, a huge increase in hate crimes. So, yeah, I think the evidence base is what makes the difference in terms of what we're doing.
What I'm looking here is that you mentioned that regional and local media is better than the national media. I wonder if the news agencies have more sway when it comes to national media as compared to the local media, which is connected with communities, care for communities, and know people.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of our findings, that AFP, AP, and Reuters were the biggest drivers in terms of negative portrayals of Muslim and Islam, and that, national newspapers specifically pick up on that wire agency copy and either just regurgitate it verbatim, with the only difference being that sometimes they go even further and sensationalize the headlines. But the regional and national statistics were more for television channels. So television channels, the regional and local ones, did far better. And I think it is what you say, they have far more contact with their local communities. They're held to account more so. I think they cover things like hate crimes and Islamophobia, or even positive stories where there's Muslim initiatives that just wouldn't get the coverage on national, news channels. And I think when it comes to the national agenda, Muslims are only reported on in terms of crisis, or when there's, a terrorist attack, or when it's a negative story. That's what they thrive on. So that's the kind of reality when it comes to local versus national in terms of broadcast.
When I hear the percentages which you are sharing about the national media negativity, our national media negativity, which came out in a couple of studies, is 92% of headlines are negative in one way or the other. That includes mainstream media like New York Times and Washington Post. So it seems British media is somewhat better. I don't know if both studies are comparable, but tell me this. Has there been an improvement in media coverage? Because you have done these studies for 3 years now, as compared to the first report or the second report. Do you see some improvement?
I think it's difficult to compare, because obviously the first report was just a quarterly. And also it always depends on the news cycle and on the kind of stories that are kind of appearing and making the headline. So it's very difficult to do that kind of comparison. And I think maybe, in a couple of years' time, what we'll be able to do is look at when we first started out and our findings then, and what's happened in that kind of period. But what we can say is that we have seen differences when it comes to certain newspapers. We are complaining less to them. We see far less sensationalist headlines. We know that organizations are implementing some of our recommendations. They're using our reports and evidence base to inform those those guidelines and practices within newsrooms. We sit on advisory panels for some of the newspapers. We feed into regulators' guidelines on how to report on Muslims and Islam. So I think slowly things, in a small way are beginning to change, but I would not say that, they've improved. The negativity and the negative portrayal of Muslims and Islam still prevails. And I think that will take a long time because, you can have the best of wills at the top. So an editor, that we speak to very much says, yes, we're going to implement this and we want to make changes. But that the culture within newsrooms and organizations takes time to change. It takes time for all of that to trickle down. And I think also, here at the moment, and I don't know if it's the case in the States, but there's a huge kind of debate about diversity and inclusion now. And especially within the media, it's become quite apparent that, because of the levels of criticism that have been meted out towards them, that there just aren't enough Muslims or Black people or other minorities that are represented either within, newspapers or broadcasters, both on the level of journalists, but definitely on the level of kind of senior editorial decision makers, but also the output. I think it doesn't matter how many Muslims or Black people you have within an organization, if the peer pressure is very strong to conform, and there isn't actually a policy that says, no, what we're going to allow is different perspectives, and this is going to impact on the output in terms of the coverage and the kind of stories we tell and the way we tell them and from whose perspective we tell them, I think only then will we begin to see some change. But that's a mindset change, that's a cultural change, that's, practices that need to change. So I think that will take its time, but we're just going to keep plugging away at it until we see some kind of incremental changes.
Now, the news agencies you mentioned are a major problem, and I would add another dimension to it, that once news agency does the work for you, journalists sitting across the world essentially are translating whatever they are saying. They have invented the term in their language to correspond to what they are saying. So is there a special effort to influence news agencies? I was looking at a AFP News. In the same story, the same organization is mentioned less by their name, but more by fundamentalist, hardliner, extreme this. And there were about, I think I counted about 5, 6, including the terrorist. So the news agencies, do you think they are open to a dialogue for such a thorough report which you have presented to them?
Yeah, no, we have engaged with them. I mean, with Associated Press, for example, the London Bureau, unfortunately, the editor-in-chief passed away this year, but he was somebody we were engaging with very heavily. We engage with Reuters, we are going to be, and I think our emphasis now after these findings is going to be to actually target, the news agencies, and specifically because when it comes to foreign news, the bulk of the copy comes from these news agencies. And we've seen in the coverage of whether it's, to do with Palestine or Israel or events that are happening in India or in Pakistan, we see that there's very skewed language that's used. So, when it comes to Palestine, it's spoken of as a conflict, as if it's between two equals. The whole fact of occupying forces versus, civilians with stones and slings isn't put into context. When it comes to India, it's very much seen as if it's a communal conflict, and that they're of equal powers again. It's not emphasized enough that it's an agenda by the BJP, and that the police, in many occasions when mobs are targeting Muslims, they're actually being supported by the police. You don't get the full coverage from news agencies, and so when it comes to international news, I think we will very specifically be working with the news agencies to try and get terminology right. And that's another thing that we're actually working on. It's quite a long project, but when we engage with editors and journalists, they always say, well, look, we know that sometimes we get the terminology wrong, but sometimes we don't know what to say. And it'd be great if we had a resource where we knew how and when to say things and not to say things, or what term to use. So over the past year, we've been working on a terminology guidebook where we've taken initially just 150 keywords that appear constantly in the media, from problematic ones like Islamism, to fundamental terrorism, to jihad, and then to the less, and Sharia, for example, which is very much misinterpreted here. So what we've done is we've taken these words, we've gone back to the original source, the Quran and the Hadith, to show the context in which they were used and how they were used and the meaning. We've looked at scholarly interpretations, and then what we've done is looked at how they're used and more often misused in the media. And then we've made recommendations in terms of if they are to be used, the context within which they can be used, or alternatives that can be used. So it's still a piece of work. We should be finalizing it, and early next year we should be publishing this guidebook. And it's quite a huge piece of work and a good resource, we think, for working journalists. So yeah, that's another thing that inshallah will be coming out next year.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Rizwana Hamid, for your great work. She is Director of Muslim Council of Britain's Center for Media Monitoring. Thank you so much, and assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you for having me on.